right, 1 Samuel chapter number 17. 1 Samuel 17. During our early service this morning, our 9:30 service, I preached the first 20 verses of this chapter. And so to finish this message up this morning, we're going to start in verse 21. 1 Samuel 17, the title of the message is Battle Ready. We need to be battle ready. Most of you know 1 Samuel 17 deals with the story of David and Goliath. I love this story. For many people, that's their favorite story in the Bible. But it's a good one, and we're going to look at it again today and hopefully learn some lessons from it that will be a blessing to us. 1 Samuel 17, beginning in verse 21. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. So we know the story of the Philistines and the Israelites battling here in the valley of Elah. Verse 22, David had been sent by his father to send some goodies to his brothers who were there, 3 of his brothers. And it said in verse 22 that David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up? And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. All right, so David arrives there at the camp of the Israelites, again to send some goodies, bring some goodies to his brothers from his father, his family. And David arrives, and then all of a sudden he sees what's going on. There's a great battle going on. It really wasn't a battle at that time, but they're on either side of this valley. And then Goliath comes out. 9 foot, 6-inch tall man, huge guy, giant, the giant Goliath. He comes out, and he defies the armies of Israel. And David heard it at that time. And I got news for you. Everybody in that camp had the same attitude, that debilitating fear. We read it. They were all scared of Goliath. Nobody wanted to fight him. They were afraid. But I got news for you. David was the only one who saw things straight. David was the only one of all the Israelites who saw things the way they were to be seen. Now, most of them looked at Goliath and they said, he is too big to kill. He is too big to kill. You know what David said? He's too big to miss. That's what he said. He's too big to miss. Man, this big old guy out here, he is just too big to miss. Now, I got news for you. David was the only one that saw it straight. Most people saw Goliath, and that's all they saw. You know what David saw? He said, the Lord can take care of this situation. He saw, when David saw Goliath, he was smitten. You know, all the Israelite warriors, they were smitten. They were smitten with fear. But I got news for you. David was smitten with concern. He was concerned about the reputation of God and God's people. David was angry. He was angry, and by the way, you know, we talked about justifiable anger. Well, this is one of the justifiable angers right here. He was angry, and he was justified in being angry because God's people and God's reputation was at stake here. He was concerned that an ungodly man like Goliath could get away with public defiance of God, and that nobody was going to do anything about it. I'll remind you this morning that the believer with a grace orientation will be victorious in a crisis when other people are not. A believer with a grace orientation will be victorious in a crisis when other people are not. Let's look at verse 28. Go back down, or go to verse 28. It says, When Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? You think he was being a little sarcastic with his baby brother. He said, I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart. For thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I done? What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. Now, David's heart, when he arrived on the scene and he heard this Goliath out there defying God and defying the people of Israel, let me tell you something. David's heart was stirred for battle. And now his brothers come to him and start accusing him of all sorts of things and trying to get on his case, in essence. And that made him even more determined. You ever done that? Somebody said, well, you can't do it. And that makes you even more determined to go do it. Well, David was even more determined to go do it. And I love this thought, that they had no courage. They had no courage, and yet they criticized David for his courage. Isn't that just backwards? They had no courage, and yet they criticized David for his courage. Look at verse 31. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. So now, David is out here telling everybody, he said, listen, there's a call. And hey, I'll go fight the guy. If none of y'all want to fight him, I'll go fight him. Now here is this young man. He's probably 14, 15, maybe 16 or 17 at this time. Let's see, Evan, how old are you, 14 or 15? 14? All right, come up here a second. All right, here's that. He's 14 years old. This is about the same size as David was, okay? Now, Ben, come up there. Here's Goliath. Who do you think's going to win this battle? I think he's in trouble. I mean, just imagine this, right? And you know, it's just that kind of way. I'm going to get my hand. Thank you very much. It's just that way. David says, I'll fight the guy. I'll fight him. And it just became obvious that he was going to do it. So they sent word to Saul. Notice verse 32. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. For thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. You're just some punk teenager. You can't fight with him. Man, this guy's a warrior. And David said unto Saul, and this goes along with the earlier message today, thy servant kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. All right, so now it became obvious again that David was going to fight this guy. There wasn't nobody going to get in his way. And so word was sent to the king. Saul tried to discourage him. He said, no, you don't need to do this. No. You just this little guy, and he's a big old guy. You're not going to win. He's going to tear you from limb to limb. He is going to just maul you. And he all it takes is one swipe. He's going to pick you up, and he's going to throw you 100 yards down the way. You have to read between the lines in the Hebrew to get all that, but that's what he said. Saul said, well, I tell you what, okay, you're going to fight him, I'll give you my armor. Now you can imagine putting a man's armor on a teenager, a smaller teenager. And David, of course, put it on and tried it, but it was all bulky. I mean, here he was probably walking around like this, and it was all falling off of him. And he said, okay, I'm just going to pass on your armor. He just ended up graciously refusing. And see, it's at this point that many of us go wrong. I want you to listen to me. This is very important. God calls us to a task, and He puts us through long and careful preparation for this task. And then we have complete confidence that we are following God's will, but those around us do not understand our zeal or our confidence in God. They have not been personally called to this particular task. And they have not caught the vision that God has given us. They didn't really understand what's in our heart. And at first, a lot of times, they try to discourage us. Number of years ago, and this breaks my heart to this day to even think about it. We went to summer camp. We took some teenagers to summer camp. This was, again, many years ago. And one of the young men that was in our church at the time, he was probably like a junior in high school. He told me, he said, I think the Lord wants me to preach. I think the Lord wants me to be a preacher. I said, well, boy, hallelujah. And so I talked with him, and he just offered his life to the Lord to be a preacher. He got back and told his mom and dad. His mom and dad said, you're not going to be a preacher. You're not going to be a preacher. They discouraged him. He's not a preacher today. His mom and daddy's divorced today. But they discouraged him. He caught this vision. He caught this determination, this confidence in what God wanted him to do. And there are some people who try to discourage you. And if that fails, then they'll try to help you. And let me tell you something. Saul, I believe here, really wanted David, of course, to succeed. He wanted David to kill Goliath. But Saul did not understand what David understood, that God's battle must be won in God's fashion. Now, how tragic it would have been of David, having perfectly trusted the Lord to this point, and learned those lessons about killing that bear and killing that lion, if he had stopped leaning on the Lord and what the Lord had him to do and started leaning on human things and what Saul wanted him to do, then he would start depending on his resources instead of God. And let me tell you something, such an approach can lead to an eventual defeat. I guarantee you, if David had gone out there with Saul's armor on, you can just imagine this armor, this old bulky armor on David, there's no way he would have won that battle. You can't do God's work in man's way. The vision must come from God. The preparation must come from God. The empowerment must come from God. Our own methods and efforts are as useless as Saul's armor. And David should certainly be our example because he refused Saul's armor. You know what he chose? He said, God has given me this sling. He's given me the expertise with this sling. And then I know that God is going to give me the power somehow, some way. I've killed that bear and I killed that lion. And God has delivered me in the past. And so we're just going to go out there and we're just going to do it God's way. We're going to do it God's way instead of Saul's way. Verse 41. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David. And the man that bare the shield went before him. Boy, I'm telling you, did ever such opposites meet. Did ever such opposites meet. Here is Goliath, this almost 10-foot man. They'd like to have him playing basketball. I'd like him on my team. Just feed him the ball. All he got to do is stand there and dunk it. He don't even have to jump. Almost 10-foot tall man. Huge. He had all this armor on. And this heavy armor on. I mean, it wasn't no cheap stuff. This heavy armor on. He had this big old sword and this big old spear. And man, this guy was just humongous. And here's little old David. But a youth. Little old guy. No armor. All he had was a little sling and 5 smooth stones. Look at verse 42. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and a spear and a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. We see Goliath, man, he comes out there and he says, oh, they finally sent somebody to fight me. And they sent somebody that was not an adult. They didn't send anybody that was big. They didn't send anybody that was tall. They didn't send anybody who had muscles. They didn't send anybody out there that even wore any armor, didn't have any armor on, didn't have a helmet, didn't even have a sword or a spear or anything. They sent this guy out, this little old punk guy right out here. And he started cursing. And he started cursing David and cursing God and anybody else that would listen. And said, Am I just a dog? You're going to send this little guy out to fight me? Verse 45 again, Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistine this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. In this little brief exchange between Goliath and David, David answers all the pertinent questions for what's going on. All the pertinent questions for what's going on. You know, when we have questions, we want to know why and how and when and where and who and all those kind of things and what. Well, David answers every one of those questions in these verses right here. He said the idea of, okay, why is this happening? Why are we having this little disagreement here? And it's really a big disagreement, of course. But David said, why is what's going on here? He said, Your taunting of Israel is actually an affront and an offense to God. That's why we're having this disagreement. That's why I'm standing out here in front of you this morning. Because you have made an affront to God and to His people. And then David answers another question. David answers a good question. Who is getting ready to whoop you today, boy? He said, I, David, will slay you, Goliath, today. Because he said, what is going to be the outcome of all this? The question is asked, what's going to be the outcome of all this? Well, David basically said, it's going to be total victory, Goliath. It's not going to be just you that's going down today, but it's going to be all of the Philistines who are going down today. And then the question might be, Goliath might be over there and he said, well, I wonder how this is going to happen. I wonder how this is going to happen. Well, David answers that question. He said, it's not by human might upon which you rely, but it's going to be by God's power today that you're going down and the Philistines are going down. And then Goliath might have said, well, I wonder where this is going to happen. David said, it's going to happen right here. It's getting ready to happen right here. And then, of course, the last question is, when is this going to happen? When is this going to happen? And David answered that one too. He said, it's getting ready to happen right now. It's getting ready to happen right now. So every one of the questions that you would ask about what's going on was answered in what David just said here in verses 45, 46, and 47. Every one of them says, you're getting ready to go down, buddy. And it's going to be right now. And it's going to be by God's power, not by the human might that you rely upon. Well, we know that David initiated the attack here. And we know that David ran toward him. Look at verse number 48. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. So David initiated the attack. He ran toward him. And you can just imagine that Goliath had to be absolutely surprised. Absolutely surprised. And amazed that this little guy is actually running toward him, because what did everybody else do when Goliath showed up? They started backing up. This guy's running at him just as hard as he can run. Then it says, David put his hand in his bag, verse 49, and he took thence a stone, and he slang it. I love that way he slang it. And he smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. Boy, David, I mean, man, this, you know, he's real good with that sling, by the way. And where did he learn to be so good? Practice. Oh, he's not the TV sheet. You got too many people that sit on the TV all day. You got too many people that sit playing video games. David, we could almost call him the Israelite sniper. I mean, man, he just sniped this guy right off. There was no hope for him whatsoever. A tremendous victory had been achieved. A unique victory had been achieved. The mysterious combination of the human and the divine. Again, David's countless hours practicing the sling. And then God, of course, contributed by His Spirit, guiding and enabling His servant. And I got news for you. All great spiritual achievements come from a combination of those two factors. You say, I want God to use me. Well, I tell you what, you better get busy and learning about God and knowing what God wants you to do. You just cannot sit around and say, I want God to use me. You got to be everything you can be. Study to show thyself approved unto God. A workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. We've got to be about our business, but then God uses us in a great way. And listen, notice verse 50. Let's look at verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. And I'll mention this again. I think it's interesting to think about. Somebody says, why did David have 5 stones? Did he think he was going to need 5 in order to, maybe he'd miss 4 times and he would need 5? Nope. Goliath had 4 brothers. And so we'll get them all if we need to. We'll just take them all. The rest of them want to do the same thing Goliath did. We'll take them all. We'll do them all. Now, David prevailed, verse 50, over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. He smote the Philistine, slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Man, they took off. Who was scared now? Who was fearful now? It was the Philistines. It was the bad guys. And the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted, verse 52, and pursued the Philistines till thou come to the valley, to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sharam, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines. They spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. He put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. The king said, inquire thou whose son the stripling is. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am a son of thy servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite. If you'll notice in those last few verses, David did not become proud. Somebody who has just achieved a major victory. Man, I just killed Goliath. Man, everybody else was scared to death. I just killed him. And man, you talk about just your head blowing up. A lot of people would be that way. But David did not become proud. God had lifted him up, but he didn't lift himself up. And because let me tell you something, you can win a battle, but then you can lose the war if you get full of pride. You can win the battle, but you can lose the war if you get full of pride, just because you won the battle. David won that battle also, the battle against pride. You can just imagine David could have went to his brothers, which he did not do. He could have went to his brothers and said, well, I took care of that guy. Y'all were scared to death, you bunch of scaredy cats, good for nothing, sorry. He could have said that to his brothers. He didn't say that. They didn't have any respect for him before this. And he could have put it on them, but he didn't. He was very gracious. And he could have even come back to King Saul right here in the last couple of verses. You know what he could have said to Saul? He just, Saul said, well, remind me of who you are. He said, my daddy's Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Oh, yeah. He could have, you know what he could have said to Saul? He could have said this. He said, hey, I'm the guy that's getting ready to move you out. I'm the guy that's getting ready to move you out, buddy. But he didn't say it. He was very humble toward King Saul. Here's some lessons to learn from this story that we've read here this morning. I'll remind you that every one of us here this morning have our own Goliaths. We have our own giants in our lives. With God's help, you can slay them as well. Everybody here has some kind of giant in their life that they're dealing with. What are some of these giants? Some people are fearful. Some people are full of guilt. Some people are anxious. Some people are depressed. Some people don't feel like they mean anything to anybody. Somebody here today might be on the verge of suicide. You just don't feel like you mean anything to anybody. Let me tell you something. God gives you great worth and great purpose in this life. Some people fight temptation and anger and discouragement, jealousy and temper, inferiority, loneliness, impossibilities, a lack of faith, resentment, bitterness, your speech, your tongue. Some people, the giants, they question about death, marriage situations that may be happening in your life, family problems, financial problems, the trials that are coming into your life. You may have a weight problem, a smoking problem, a lust problem. You may have job problems. Whatever you may have here this morning, it's a Goliath in your life, and it's a very intimidating experience, whatever you're fighting. And you look up and there's some big old 10-foot guy, 10-foot thing standing in front of you. And you wonder, how am I going to fight that? Very intimidating. But David saw through the eyes of faith. Goliath, however, even though David saw him through the eyes of faith, Goliath was still big. Faith does not blind us to the external, but enables us to see beyond them as we draw on God's power. And I'll remind you this morning, listen, fighting your Goliath is a lonely experience, because your Goliath is your Goliath. Let that sink in a moment. Your Goliath is your Goliath. Matter of fact, you look at what you're facing, and it may not be gigantic to somebody else, but it is gigantic to you. And I got news for you. There's no pastor, no counselor, no friend, no family member can tell you what you should or should not do with this giant in your life, because it's your giant. And let me tell you something. You and the Lord can fight this giant alone. How many people was out there with David fighting Goliath? So we all face our own Goliaths. But we may be alone humanly speaking, but we're not alone, because the Lord's with us. The Lord is with us. The things that you have to go through in your life, I may not have to go through them. The things that I go through in my life, you may not have to go through, but we all have those giants and Goliaths in our life. But the Lord is there to help us face those giants. And I'll tell you what, I'll tell you this much. When you're in the midst of the battle, trusting God is a stabilizing experience. In battle against Goliath, David did not let the jitters interfere. I got news for you. David was not out there, I don't know if I can do this. No. He had complete trust and faith in God, that God was going to give him the ultimate victory. And let me tell you something. You just turn a giant over to God. You cast all your care upon him because he cares for you. It is amazing how stable you can be. And then lastly, I'll tell you that winning victories is a memorable experience. When you do have victory over that giant in your life, whatever it may be, let me tell you something. That's something you can draw from in the days ahead and the weeks ahead and the months ahead. You can remember how God helped you. And see, when David went out there to face Goliath, you know what he thought about? You know what he thought about? He said, you know what? God gave me the victory over that bear, which a bear should be something that should be able to tear us up. But David told him, God gave me victory over that lion. That lion should be able to tear us up. God gave me the victory over it. And God's going to give me. So what we do is God gives us victory today over something in our lives, and then we face another giant later on, and we remember, hey, God gave me victory before. He can give me victory again. He can give me victory again. And those giants, ladies and gentlemen, can be defeated. They can be defeated. But you got to be battle ready. You got to be battle ready through the power of God. And God can give us the victory. Heads are bowed and eyes are closed.